Thank you, Eliza. Hi, everyone. I'm very honored to be here. Thank you for having me. I haven't rehearsed this, and I'll try to not get confused by my three screens here. But I guess I'll just start and present to you what we worked on, and afterwards we might have some time to talk about it, or maybe you have some questions, or you want to follow up on some details that I cut out here. Yes, I hope you can see my screen. I'm going to be talking about long-term trends in carabid beetles in German forests. That was work by mainly me and Andreas Linde, who is or was my PhD supervisor, but we also had some help from other people who are co-authors they mentioned here. Maybe a few words about me. Until recently, I was a researcher at Eberswalde University for Sustainable Development, close to Berlin. I'm also a PhD candidate at Leuphana University, also in Germany. The thesis was just submitted, but in the meantime, we have moved to New Zealand, or I moved to New Zealand now, and I work as a data scientist at Cawthron Institute now. Andreas is a professor at Eberswalde University for Sustainable Development, working in applied ecology and zoology. That's him. He's around today, so he will join for the questions probably. And yes, I'll be mainly presenting the content of two papers that we worked on. One is published, one is in the pipeline, and they're basically the core of my PhD work. So back in 2019, when my PhD started, you probably all know this paper. That was kind of the situation then. News had just reached, broad public about insect declines. The kind of the picture of this was still quite unspecific. There were different voices, people saying, we know enough, let's act. Others saying, oh, we actually don't know anything. We need more data. And yeah, there was still this kind of perception of this general decline going on everywhere, but not that much information. And Andreas and I, we found, or we had the impression that actually open landscapes were overrepresented in the research that was available, at least back then. But I think although there are some studies now from forests, this is actually still the case today. I think that might be related to that, like some of the obvious drivers, such as agriculture, urbanization, are, at least in Central Europe, kind of associated with open landscapes. But forests are also affected by climate change, for example. And in 2019, when we started, we were just in the middle of a period of severe drought in Central Europe. You could see the effects in forests already. This is an example from one of our study sites, a beech tree, European beech. And actually, we had trouble getting our permits driving through the forest because of fire danger. So it was very imminent and real. And looking back, there's actually a number of studies coming out now finding that this was unprecedented in Central Europe, right? You can see this. This is a very nice paper that got out in 22. And you can see that, wait, I'm moving my cursor. I hope you can see it, that this drought in 2018 to 2020 was the longest and most severe in the last centuries. So Andreas and I started out with a goal, or the broad question: what are the trends of insects in forests, the forests around us in Germany, and how might they be affected by the recent droughts that we just experienced? So one motivation for this research was also that we had access to a long-term data set. Andreas had been collecting carabid beetles around Eberswalde, that's where the university is, since the early 90s. And in the course of teaching activities, before this, we just briefly talked about it. So Andreas goes there every year, samples insects or carabid beetles with students, and he's been doing this with like highly standardized methods. I'm very grateful for that, Andreas. So we had this data set, very local data from around the university, but being collected since the early 90s. And when starting to work on this topic, we also learned about another data set, kind of unearthed it. Susanne Winter, who's also one of our collaborators and co-authors, did her PhD on beech forests ecology back in the late 90s, and she sampled forest carabid beetles in that region at different forest sites from 1999 to 2001. And I actually went back for another 3 years, from 2020 to 2022, and resampled these sites with the exactly same methods. I went back to the same plots. So creating this kind of snapshot data set 3 years back then, 3 years now at the same sites. And maybe some more information about the two data sets. They actually, the forest sites are quite similar. It's both old forests, mainly old beech forests. The management intensity is very, very low, or they're not managed at all. Most of the sites are strictly protected, and even if there are management interventions, it's single tree harvest only. They're actually pulling out the trees with horses. So it's very low management intensity, and management hasn't changed in the past 25 years or longer. There were no greater interventions. We're pretty confident that landscape composition around that didn't change. So very, very stable forests actually, and they're very there's a high conservation interest because they represent the natural type of forest that would be present in that area. And there's rich in structure. Two of the sites are actually UNESCO heritage sites. Most sites are located in the UNESCO Biosphere Reserve Schorfheide-Kurin. There's also a site in a national park. So yeah, pretty much the best forest we have around in this area, right? And very similar, as I said, between this local site around the University of Andreas data and the sites of the snapshot data. And maybe quickly, why carabid beetles? Well, there's an opportunistic component to it, of course, because we had the data available, but also we think it's a very interesting group to study. Insect biodiversity of the forest floor is still often overlooked, although it's so important. There's a lot going on in the soil and the litter layer. Carabid beetles specifically are very sensitive to environmental conditions. They're often used as bioindicators, and especially in those old growth beech forests that we are looking at, there's lots of specialist species around. So large predatory species adapted to cool environments, moist environments, stable conditions, and they're predators, and they play a very important role in the food webs. So we think it's a very interesting group to look at, and that's what we did. The rough concept of these two data sets working together is that we have this one continuous time series of carabid data, although very limited in space, right, from this local site. But we can use this to kind of look at what happened over time, also look at non-linear trends, and we can closely examine what the influence of drought was and how it acted on different spatial temporal scales. But we also have this snapshot data, which we can use to validate what we see in the local data and see what happens throughout the region on a larger spatial scale. So that was the rough idea. And we started out with the local data set, the continuous time series from this one local study site. And this is a map. You can see it's very local. It's an area roughly one kilometer by 1 kilometer. There's 13 plots where students sampled carabid beetles every year. I have to add again, it's very standardized. Andreas is setting up the traps. Identification is done or validated by a colleague of ours who has a lot of experience. So there should be, this data is very consistent. Not all of these plots were sampled throughout all the years, but we included data from plots that were sampled at least for 3 years. And there's a very good number of these plots that were sampled for almost the entire 24 years. So we used data from 1999 to 2022. Data sampled from May to July every year. And we actually looked at 1,866 pitfall trap samples, which contained more than 24,000 carabid beetles. Maybe about the study site quickly, you see the map here. It's close to the urban outskirts of Eberswalde, which is in the north. This area in the middle that you might spot here is a nursery that hasn't changed in the past decades. This forest is largely deciduous forest, so broadleaf forest, most of it old beech forest. There's some sides of it with some mixed forests. There's a bit pine forest too, but most of it is old beech forest, and most of it is not managed at all. So no interventions in the past 24 years. And this whole area is part of a larger forest area. So this is not a little fragment of forest, but this is part of a large forest area. This is the type of traps we used. Actually, the same type of trap throughout both data sets. Sometimes the very same traps were actually used because the other data set was also back then done with the same university. Yeah, so sampling methods were also consistent between the two data sets mostly. And we started out for this continuous data with 2 working hypotheses. We said carabid beetles in the study area are not affected by any continuous long-term declines because we thought, you know, these forests are very stable and there shouldn't be much drivers around causing any declines. But recent drought-related declines, but there are recent drought-related declines in abundance, biomass, and diversity. That was our hypothesis because drought was so severe. And we also said, or postulated, carabid species representing certain traits are more often affected by drought-related declines because we thought maybe these large, predatory, immobile carabid species are more sensitive, right? They are the forest specialists adapted to the conditions. And from other carabid studies, we know that large predatory flightless species are very sensitive to change and disturbance, and they require stable habitats. We looked at these different metrics, abundance, biomass. We calculated biomass using size weight models, maybe some information on that later. We looked at that biodiversity using different indices, so different hill numbers standardized by coverage, but we also looked at species turnover, and we picked a number of traits that we found interesting, which were size, wing morphology representing dispersal abilities, feeding guild, so predatory, omnivorous, or herbivory, humidity preference, which we took from another reference, latitudinal center of distribution with the thought of, you know, species that have a distribution range, which is more north, might be more sensitive to like extreme conditions such as heat and drought, and local abundance, because we wanted to know, is it actually the abundant species that are declining, or is it rarer species disappearing? And we analyzed the data using GLMMs for linear trends, GAMMs for nonlinear trends, and we used the drought index, the SPEI, the standardized precipitation evapotranspiration index, as an additional predictor for the GLMMs to test the drought effect. And we computed this index on different temporal scales. So maybe quickly, the way this index works is it's calculated as a monthly index based on precipitation and temperature, and it's calculated for a kind of moving window of time, and you can adapt the size of this window. So you can base this drought index on just the last month, but you can extend this period and kind of let this index represent how dry were actually the past 12 months or 6 years. And it's a relative index, so it's expressing a relative measure of drought for your site. Yes, and we calculated this based on publicly available weather data. Yes, and for the species traits, we developed species-specific GLMMs. So for the 27 most abundant species, we fitted trend models, also tested like how meaningful was the drought index as a predictor for the trend of the individual species. And then we simply plotted these against traits. So this is a bit more on the exploratory side. I think you will see the results in a few minutes. So this is how the abundance data looked like. You can see that's count data. It's very, very dispersed, right? Some kind of even almost outliers in here. We fitted the linear model and ended up with a linear decline of that's the geometric mean of 3.1% per year on average. Just this plotted on another scale to make it more visible. And now the other models, we fitted the nonlinear model, the GAMM, and actually saw, well, what was going on was not entirely linear. Abundance first declined and then kind of recovered before dropping again after 2015. That's what we saw in for abundance. And we added, we tested this drought index as an additional predictor in the linear model. We found that generally the longer-term drought index was more meaningful, and we tried lagging it, and we found that if we lag it by 2 years, it's most relevant. So actually what was going on in terms of drought index was a strong predictor for abundance of carabid beetles 2 years later. And if you make predictions with this linear model, but incorporating values of this drought index, so predicting, this is actually not a non-linear model, right? The red one, but it's the linear model. We just added in we just made the predictions based on the drought situation at that time. And what pretty much blew our minds was that it's very, very closely fitting to that blue line, which is the nonlinear model, which is a very, very flexible model, actually closely fitting to our data. So we saw that if we just included this drought index, we could closely match the non-linearity of what was going on. But that's also important to mention, there's still a component of time in there, even if we include the drought index, we still have a independent kind of linear decline, which we can't explain with this drought index over time. Maybe moving on to biomass. Well, just maybe this number is important. Just after 2015, we saw a decline of 71% in carabid abundance. And this down here are the confidence intervals. So you can see it's far away from zero. So we're pretty confident there were strong declines, especially in these past years. Moving on to biomass, we can see that the trends and this drought effect was even more pronounced. So, and you can see again, if we use, and that's the same drought index, the long-term 6 years in this case. So considering the precipitation and temperature of the previous 6 years, and then again lagged by 2 years. So on a very long-term perspective. And it's again a strong predictor and matching the non-linearity pretty closely. I just plotted this again with the actual drought index, how we used it, and just to put it on the same scale, the biomass predictions of the GAMM, and you can kind of see how well it is fitting with this kind of 2-year delay. I mean, it's not perfect, but you can see this, and we had this severe drought, this unprecedented drought somewhere here, and maybe interesting to mention that there was another shorter but also severe drought in 2003, which kind of corresponds with this local minima here. At least that's my interpretation. As I mentioned, we also looked at diversity, and this is interesting because, well, the first one, this is standardized richness. That's the Q0 in terms of hill numbers, which represents a species richness. And we can see, well, there's a non-significant linear trend. It's kind of, when we try non-linear models, it's kind of hump-shaped, recovering a little bit. And drought as a predictor is meaningful in terms of model selection, but it's actually having a positive effect here, a slightly positive effect. And if we look at the Simpson or Q2 in terms of hill numbers, a diversity index kind of giving more weight to more abundant species, less weight to rare species. We see a linear decline, but we didn't detect any non-linear trends. We didn't detect drought as a meaningful predictor. We also looked at evenness. We saw a linear decline over the years that kind of sped up in recent years, looking at the non-linear trend. And here, drought was also a good predictor for non-linearity, kind of negatively influencing evenness. And then we looked at species turnover. This was based on Jacquard dissimilarity over time with the first years as a reference. So this kind of going down represents the community, the carabid species community is becoming less similar over time. But I have to add, this is not standardized. This is not independent of sample size. So it might be also just an effect of abundance decreasing that much. So this is, you have to interpret this with caution, actually. Looking at the traits, as I mentioned, we fitted trend models for individual species. We looked where was the drought index a good predictor for this particular species for the trend? Does it explain the data well? And we also looked again, was the drought index a more meaningful predictor when it was lagged by a certain time? And then we plotted this again. We classified trends and drought effects based on AIC. I can mention some more details to people afterwards if that's interesting, or you can find that in the paper. But you can, the main picture basically is that we see that the declining species were bigger. That was big species, the large species declining, and that kind of overlaps with the drought sensitive species, so the species declining with drought. These are not, there's some overlap between these, between the declining species and drought sensitive species, but they're not the same. Yeah, we can, but the patterns in terms of traits are very similar, right? And so we also saw that winged species were not declining or drought sensitive, but was more the short-winged, so flightless species or dimorphic species. Interestingly, humidity preference, at least the one we took from our reference, didn't play a role that much. We didn't pick up on any pattern regarding humidity preference. In terms of feeding guild, of course, predators are overrepresented in the data set just due to the habitat. But we saw that it seemed to be mostly predators declining and also mostly predators being drought sensitive. Center of distribution didn't correspond really to what we kind of assumed. We saw that also species with a more southern distribution range declined or were drought sensitive. In terms of local abundance, which is just the number of how often we have this species sampled at our site, we see that it's also the abundant species declining. So we have some very abundant species that we didn't find any confident trend, but the declining ones also are abundant species. So it's not only the rare ones. Yes, so coming back to our hypotheses, we actually found that abundance and biomass, so we found support for the hypothesis that abundance and biomass declined with drought, were like severely affected. Not so much the diversity metrics. They didn't seem, we found some declines, but they didn't seem to be that closely linked to the drought index that we used at any scale. And we saw that it seems to be the large species with that are flightless or dimorphic and predatory that are declining or sensitive to drought, and they're also locally abundant, so not only rare species. We didn't find that much support that humidity preference played a role or the distribution range. This was published in January in Ecography, so lots more details to look up if you're interested. Now, talking about the second data set, just a quick recap. That's the data set throughout the regions where we had the snapshot data from 1999 to 2001 and again 2020 to 22. Data here was sampled from April to November in each year, so covering the whole period of carabid activity. There was 11 beech forest sites in total, kind of evenly distributed between sites that had a low management intensity and sites that were strictly protected, also some of them being UNESCO heritage sites, as I mentioned. We had 79 individual plots with pitfall traps distributed across these 11 sites that were sampled in both periods, of course. And we compared roughly 1,000 samples from back then with 1,300 samples from recent years. And that's roughly 11,000 carabid beetles altogether. And just to show you here, the black line is the drought index that we found relevant in the last analysis. And the black line represents the drought index at the study site of the last study. And the red lines are kind of the time series of drought index for these 11 study sites. And the purpose of this is just to show you that Of course, there's some local variation, but we see the same patterns throughout the whole region. So, and we know from other studies that this drought affected the whole of Central Europe, actually. So drought patterns should be consistent throughout the region. And based on that, we formulated the following hypotheses. We said, okay, severe drought leads to declines in carabid abundance, biomass, and we also included diversity because we thought there must be an effect. It's, you know, it's severe drought. But the effects on biomass will be strongest based on the insights we got from the last data set. Again, we said larger predatory species with poorer dispersal abilities are affected more strongly by declines. And we also wanted to look into variability across space. Drought effects are variable due to differences in initial community composition and local environmental context. So we thought, hey, it's interesting. Well, first of all, can we find these declines throughout the whole region? And if we can, are they consistent, or what kind of variability do we see between the sites? And do they maybe depend on, although the sites are very different, but do they maybe depend on things like the landscape composition around the forest sites, or maybe differences in carabid community back then, so initial carabid community. Again, that's kind of repetitive. I'm just doing it again because you see that we kind of analyzed these data sets in a similar way. Again, we looked at abundance, biomass, again, calculated with the same size weight model. Hill numbers, we didn't look at turnover because we were kind of skeptical. We didn't find a good way of expressing turnover in a standardized way, standardized for sample size. And also when looking at snapshot data, it's difficult to separate year-to-year turnover from this maybe potentially continuous turnover throughout time. So we only looked at hill numbers now. And we looked at those species traits we found meaningful, or where we found patterns in the last study. And we fitted GLMMs comparing these two periods to each other across sites. So for the whole region, having study site as a random effect, basically a random intercept. And again, we fitted these models this time with the study site as a fixed effect with interaction with a temperate component. So kind of looking what's going on specifically for each individual site. That will become more clear when you look at the plots, I guess. Yes, so these are the results for abundance and biomass on the bottom. You can see here across sites, we see differences in abundance and biomass. Again, the differences for biomass, the declines were stronger and more significant. And this is what I just talked about on the right side. This is when we include this interaction of site with the temporal effect, modeling trends for each site individually, just to see, you know, is this consistent? Do we have variability? And you can see declines are consistent. So they're declining in abundance at all 11 sites and in biomass at all 11 sites. You can see that this trend is more consistent for biomass than it is for abundance. Moving on to diversity, this is interesting again. We didn't find any differences. And you can see no significant differences with the data we have. And you can see that there's all kinds of things going on at different study sites, but it's not consistent. So we actually have sites with strong declines or strong increases in different diversity metrics, but it's not consistent throughout the area. And you would think, you know, drought was consistent, but we don't see any consistent changes in diversity. Continuing to the traits. Yes, maybe I need to mention we modeled all three traits based on species and based on individuals. So averaging all sampled individuals, but also just averaging traits based on species occurrence. This is helpful to differentiating whether it's declines or changes in traits are driven by individuals, maybe of an abundant species declining, or whether it's whole species kind of dropping away. And this is why we see declines in or changes in traits. And we saw, so we actually had stronger signals for these individual-based traits. And we saw that mean individual size declined significantly, not as consistently as abundance and biomass. You can see that here in the right plot. There's two sites where it's actually increased, but in all the others it declined. And also, this is, maybe I need to add that this is the probability, that's a binomial GLMM modeling the probability of sampling a winged carabid beetle. So the probability of sampling a winged beetle actually increased. And yeah, again, this was not entirely consistent, but pretty much. And it indicates significance, but I need to add also that this was very close to the threshold, right? It's 0.045 or something. So definitely a signal, but also caution, maybe. Yes, but no strong signals for the species-based traits. And then that last part about the spatial variability and how it might be linked to the initial community of carabid beetles or environmental variables. You can see here, we tested this only for biomass because we found the strongest effects in biomass and said, we could say this was like a severe impact of drought with most confidence. That's why we took biomass. And we tested all these variables as additional predictors interacting with the effect over time, kind of using our GLMM across the whole region, but using these variables as an additional predictor to kind of explain differences in the effect of time. And you can see some of these are is data on site scale, so pretty rough, just for these 11 sites, one value per site. And some of them are on the plot scale, such as canopy cover. Maybe I just quickly explain we tested all initial all initial traits of the community in 1999 to 2001. So kind of thinking whether, like, if we had very large community of very large carabid beetles, was this more strongly affected by biomass declines, or if we had a less or more mobile community, was this more affected by declines? But we also looked at canopy cover at a site scale and a plot scale, forest edge within a 1,000 meter radius, and for a distance to forest edge of the individual trap, landscape composition, that was what was the share of forest within a 1,000 meter radius around the study site. Because we're looking at a relative drought index, we also wanted to know whether differences in absolute precipitation, because there's a gradient in this area, might explain differences in biomass declines. And we also wanted to know, hey, we have these sites that are low intensity, managed with a low intensity, but we also have these sites that are strictly protected for decades now. Do we see differences between these two sites? Do we maybe have less severe declines at the strictly protected forest sites? And we saw that especially two variables turned out to explain our data very well. That was initial average individual size. So where there were larger beetles on average, there were stronger declines in biomass, and landscape composition. So we had, and this one was huge, so improving the model in terms of AIC by a lot, having a very strong interaction effect on the temporal trend. We saw that where there was more forest in this radius we looked at, declines were not as severe. I have to say, this needs to be interpreted with caution, because the sites were never selected to represent gradients in these variables, right? This is kind of exploratory. This is something we thought, hey, it's interesting to look at, but it's not, this study was not designed to test these variables. So significant values, or so p-values or effect sizes, I wouldn't like be too specific about the effect size. I still consider this like an important indication that these variables play a role in explaining our data, but we need to be careful how confidently we talk about these effects. So coming back to our hypotheses, and I'm looking at the time, I see that I have to speed it up a little bit, but coming back to the hypothesis, again, we found support that drought affected abundance and biomass, and again, strong effects on biomass. For carabid beetles, again, we didn't find any consistent effects on diversity. I think we have strong support for that. It's mostly larger species declining. Dispersal abilities, I'm kind of careful because they're all often correlated. We found strong effects for size. So I think the changes that we pick up in dispersal abilities or wing morphology might be just due to this correlation. We didn't find any stronger signal for feeding guild, but again, have to be careful because we almost only had predators in these carabid communities. So yeah, we did. It's hard to say actually. This is maybe with less confidence, and then also not in green but in gray, because we need to be careful. But we found indication that initial community traits and some environmental variables could potentially be an explanation why we see differences in declines. This is also a paper, a separate paper in review at the moment, probably published soon. I don't know if you can say if it's acceptable to mention the journal now, but maybe later. Just thinking about this, the initial concept or idea we had, bringing these two data sets together for this big question: how are carabid beetles in these beech forests doing, and how is it related to drought? These are the results of both studies plotted together, and you can see that they correspond really well. And I think we have very strong evidence that this recent period of drought affected carabid beetles in beech forests, and there were significant declines in abundance, but especially in biomass, and that it was mostly the larger species declining. And that again corresponds very well with the fact that the declines in biomass were stronger than in abundance. And not only looking at the mean that is here represented by the line and the dots, but also the confidence intervals. I think this is important information showing that we still have this big variability and large confidence intervals for trends all through here, but when drought starts, it's going down. So not only the modeled mean is decreasing, but also the confidence interval is becoming very narrow, and we can say with very big, very large confidence that these values have become very small. So I think there's just as much information in these confidence intervals actually than there is in this line. Yeah, what could be the reasons for this? This is kind of educated speculation, right? I didn't ask the beetles. It's hard to say. There might be direct effects of changes in microclimate. We know these species are sensitive, especially as larvae. Maybe they just dry up. Maybe they can't handle the heat. You know, when moisture goes down, there's also not as much cooling. Maybe it's bottom-up trophic interactions. So maybe there's some theories about soil moisture affecting, or lack of soil moisture affecting fungi communities, and that kind of then moves up, cascades up the food chain, and maybe affecting collembola, springtails, which in turn affect the carabid population. Could be also top down. We know that, for example, wild boar or birds spend more time looking in the litter layer of forests when there's drought, because they find more moisture and more food sources there. But I'm a little bit skeptical about this. So I don't think this is very likely. I think it's either direct effects of changes in microclimate or bottom-up effects through the food web. Implications. I think this is an important one, and we briefly talked about this, Dave, before the talk. By now we know that this recent drought in Central Europe was becoming more likely due to climate change. So it's already part of climate change, and these kind of droughts are predicted to increase in frequency and intensity. And we all know how the climate change predictions went. Yeah? Everything happened more quickly and more strongly than it was predicted. And I assume it will continue like this, and we will see more droughts like this. And for me, this kind of means that these changes that we saw related to the last drought will go on, maybe cause even stronger declines or shifts in the carabid community. And what we saw from this last bit of our analysis is that local protection, the efficiency of local protection is very limited. We saw, I didn't mention that a few minutes ago, but we saw very strong declines also in the very strictly protected sites. So these are some of Germany's most protected forests, and we see these declines there, independent of protection status. And maybe it's more landscape context that's relevant, at least with regard to these extreme weather events and extreme conditions. And that's also one, maybe a reason to rethink conservation and to question the effectivity of this like local conservation approaches, and rather think about the landscape level. Very quickly, we also there were some other papers that were part of this PhD, maybe useful for you or interesting. One paper we validated or evaluated size weight models. I mentioned that earlier for carabid beetles. So we evaluated them and used this for calculation of biomass in our case. And we did a little methodological studies on how we need to specify these GLMMs for insect data to give a more realistic estimate for uncertainty. That's more on the statistical side, but maybe also interesting. Yes, just because you lasted through this presentation of graphs after graphs, some footage from carabid beetles I took at the study sites. So this is Carabus violaceus eating what's left over of a toad. And then this is also very nice. I don't know if that's appropriate. Some mating ground beetles that I also spotted while collecting the traps. So these guys didn't end up in my traps. Lucky for them. Yes. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for everyone who supported me through this research. And yeah, I'm sorry that I stretched time so much. Maybe we still have a little bit time for questions or discussion.